Hey everyone, welcome to this edition of Exploring History, specifically the series on the history of Assyria. I'm actually excited to do this next episode on a truly amazing, extremely interesting Assyrian king. So in the last episode, we saw how by the 9th century BCE, the Assyrian kings had in reality lost a lot of their power to various governors, field marshals, court officials, people who we called magnates. Essentially, the Assyrian king had become more of a figurehead and at times even a puppet of other powerful individuals and their families throughout the Assyrian Empire. This all changed with the ascension of Tiglath-Pileser III to the throne of Assyria. He was just as much an administrator as a warrior. And this honestly was just what the stagnant Assyrian Empire needed to both survive and thrive. Before he adopted the throne name of Tiglath-Pileser III, he was known as Pulu, the provincial governor of the Assyrian capital city of Kalhu, also known as Nimrud. In 746 BCE, and during the reign of the previous king, Ashur-nirari V, a civil war broke out, putting various factions of the royal family at odds with one another. Pulu's faction defeated those loyal to Ashur-nirari V and seized the royal palace at Kalhu. The king's family was slaughtered, though it's not for certain if Pulu initiated the order. Pulu may also have been a member of the royal family, though not in direct line of succession. Scholars really don't know for sure, to be honest, but what is known is that he claimed the throne after the death of Ashur-nirari V and assumed the new name Tiglath-Pileser III. Once in power, Tiglath-Pileser began the difficult task of reducing the influence of various court officials, governors, field marshals, and other magnates who had amassed great wealth and power at the previous king's expense. He took the large territories that they had previously controlled and divided them up into much smaller units that could be governed much easier by those loyal to the crown. In fact, he often chose eunuchs to take over such positions because since they couldn't have children, they had no intention, let alone the ability, to produce heirs to inherit the lands which they governed. In addition, high officials and military officers no longer had the right to commission inscriptions with their own names. Only the king would be credited for any successes or large building projects. This might not seem like a big deal. However, the fact that individual magnates and field marshals were no longer individually recognized in public pronouncements and documents, even if they were responsible for victories in battle or other great deeds, psychologically showed the empire, people, and the world who exactly it was who ran the Assyrian Empire. Proof of this actually comes from the many stelae, statues, rock reliefs, and cuneiform tablets that have been found with Tiglath-Pileser's name on them. In addition, archaeologists have found many administrative texts and letters sent to Tiglath-Pileser III by important state officials, as well as spies, especially from Urartu, that show the great reach of the king's authority and information network. These were all things that were not present with the previous rulers under the sway of the many magnates who in reality ran parts of the empire from their large estates and fiefdoms. Power had once again become extremely centralized during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, something that would not change until the Assyrian Empire's final end. Now in prior years, the Assyrian army had been made up of conscripts who were forced to fight during the summer. This was because in summer, crops would have already been planted and their harvest would still be months away. Tiglath-Pileser changed this policy so that now each province was required to provide a certain number of men who would be thoroughly trained and dedicated specifically to becoming Assyrian soldiers and campaigning year-round. Thus, Tiglath-Pileser created the first professional army in history. His military campaigns went in all directions. He started with campaigns closer to home in the Babylonian territories on the eastern bank of the Tigris River. Here, he had little resistance, but a few years later, between 743 and 739 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser focused his attention and resources on Assyria's greatest northern rival, the kingdom of Urartu. In this, he won a huge victory against the Urartian king Saduri II, who according to one story, had to flee the battle on his horse. Though it was a great blow to Urartu, the kingdom still lived on. In fact, some scholars wonder just why Tiglath-Pileser didn't venture further into Urartu and simply destroy it. Perhaps he didn't want to spread himself too thin. No one knows for sure, but we do know that Suduri II continued to rule Urartu until his death in 735 BCE. Now, it wasn't just in Urartu where Tiglath-Pileser was having a lot of success, but also in northwestern Syria. He marched into Syria to take on Urartu's ally, Arpad. After a 3-year siege, the city finally succumbed to the Assyrians. Tiglath-Pileser showed little mercy and all but destroyed the city while slaughtering its inhabitants. By 734 BCE, he was at the borders of one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations, Egypt. Though he didn't invade, his presence there forced many of Egypt's client states in the Levant, such as Judah, Ammon, Moab, and Edom, to become tribute-paying vassals of the Assyrians. He's also mentioned in the Old Testament of the Bible, specifically in the book of Kings and Chronicles. In it, King Menachem of Israel is able to save himself and his city from the wrath of the Assyrians by paying them tribute and swearing loyalty to Tiglath-Pileser. In return, Menachem and his kingdom were protected by the Assyrians from common enemies, which allowed Menachem to be the only Israelite king of the time to manage to both stay alive and have his kingdom prosper. It wasn't a bad deal when you think about it, since the alternative would have been certain death and destruction under the heels of the Assyrian juggernaut. It seems, though, that Tiglath-Pileser had other interests in the region, and not simply those of land and conquest. In 1989, a tomb was discovered by Iraqi archaeologists under a palace in the Assyrian capital city of Nimrud. It was the tomb of a woman named Yaba, meaning the beautiful one, and who apparently was the principal wife of the king. Yaba, though, is a West Semitic name, so she was not of Assyrian origin. In fact, some scholars believe that she was actually a Judean princess, though this has never been proven. If this was the case, it's possible that this is the reason why Menachem's kingdom was spared. Perhaps there was some sort of marriage alliance. We don't know again for sure, but it's a pretty interesting historical occurrence. On the other end of the Middle East, Tiglath-Pileser battled with the Medes and the Persians in what is today Iran. Though he defeated them, he probably didn't conquer them outright. At the very least, though, they were made vassals of the Assyrian king. Now, one thing that I feel that we must cover is Assyria's policy with regard to deporting citizens. Well, actually, citizens, that's the wrong term. More captives of war or conquered populations. Now, this was something that many Assyrian kings had done in the past, but Tiglath-Pileser took it to a new level. As we know, the land of Assyria itself wasn't particularly large, but the space of foreign territories they by now controlled was vast. With constant campaigning, men died in battle. And with constant uprisings, because remember, the Assyrians were not very popular with the locals of the lands they conquered, there were not really a lot of men who could be spared as workers. Every soldier was valuable. So thus, deporting mass populations from one region to the other, pretty much as slaves, was how they kept their empire productive. Deportations really hurt the deportees in two ways. I suppose, though, if you are an Assyrian king or governor, these are actually two advantages to mass deportations. One, deportations uprooted an otherwise hostile population from their homeland, which killed their morale and their willingness to fight in a new land they knew little about or had a little attachment to. And two, it provided the manpower needed for all of the labor and construction projects that the Assyrians carried out. These tasks would be anything from building new farms in underdeveloped areas to erecting new palaces for the governor or king, or laying the foundation for new cities. In fact, the French author Jorge Roux describes this much better than I can, and I quote, "Whole towns and districts were emptied of their inhabitants, who were resettled in distant regions and replaced by people brought by force from other countries. In 742 and 741 BC, for instance, 30,000 Syrians from the region of Hama were sent to the Zagros Mountains, while 18,000 Aramaeans from the left bank of the Tigris were transferred to northern Syria. In Iran in 744 BC, 65,000 persons were displaced in one single campaign. In another year, the exodus affected no less than 54,000 people in southern Mesopotamia. Such pitiful scenes are occasionally depicted on Assyrian bas-reliefs. Carrying little bags on their shoulders and holding their emaciated children by the hand, long files of men walk with the troops, while their wives follow in carts or riding on donkeys or horses. A pitiful and no doubt partially real spectacle, but deliberately intensified for propaganda purposes. For while one of the aims of deportation was to punish rebels or prevent rebellions, it also had other objectives: to uproot what would now be called national feelings, i.e., fidelity to local gods, ruling families, and traditions; to fill new towns on the borders, in conquered territories, and in Assyria proper; to repopulate abandoned regions and develop their agriculture; to provide the Assyrians not only with soldiers and troops of laborers who would build cities, temples, and palaces, but also with craftsmen, artists, and even scribes and scholars. That's the end of the quote. So it's probably because of this also that the Aramaic language, one that would become the lingua franca for the region for centuries to come, took root. With so many people of different origins being spread out across the ancient Middle East to new areas that they were unfamiliar with, Aramaic became the common tongue that bounded the peoples of the empire together. The last years of Tiglath-Pileser's reign focused back on Babylon. In the countryside there, conflicts had arisen between city elites, Chaldean warlords, and Aramaean tribes, causing a lot of instability. In 731 BCE, a certain Chaldean by the name of Mukinzeri seized the throne of Babylon, hence becoming king of all of Babylonia. Now this was something that Tiglath-Pileser could not let stand. As we've mentioned several times in this series, and despite many conflicts with its rulers, Babylonia, especially the city of Babylon, was considered culturally and religiously holy to the Assyrians. Babylonia was firmly in the sphere of Assyrian influence, and only the Assyrian king had the right to dictate who would rule there on his behalf, certainly not some Chaldean. Thus, in 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser attacked Mukinzeri and soundly defeated him without much trouble. Instead of appointing his own man, Tiglath-Pileser himself assumed the title King of Babylon. Wanting to win the hearts and minds of Babylon's citizens, he participated twice in the holy Akidu festival that honored Babylonians' chief and patron god, Marduk. All this was a pretty fitting end to a great career as king of Assyria. Actually, a better title would have been Emperor. Emperor of Assyria, I should have said. After all, during his nearly 2 decades on the throne, Tiglath-Pileser had both strengthened the power of the monarchy to make it once again absolute, and also doubled the empire's territory in terms of square kilometers. This was done through the new administrative system that he created to better serve his interests, as well as his shrewd military leadership, meaning that he did not outsource most campaigns to his field marshals and generals, as was often the case during the Age of Magnates, something that we actually discussed in the previous episode of this series. When Tiglath-Pileser III died in 727 BCE, Assyria was back on the world stage and more powerful than ever. It was hard to imagine that it could become even more powerful, but this is exactly what happened when Tiglath-Pileser's sons took over. One of them, who many deemed a usurper, arguably became the greatest Assyrian ruler of all time. He even took as his throne name that of another of Mesopotamia's greatest historical figures, the one whom all rulers, whether they liked him or not, aspired to be like. This king was Sargon II of Assyria, and his fascinating story will be told in the next segment of History of Assyria, so stay tuned. Thank you so much for stopping by the channel. I really appreciate it, and I hope you learned something. If you found this video useful, please hit that like button because it helps the channel out tremendously. Thanks a lot and have a great day.